Hello, this is Gavin de Costa. Audio lecture number 3, looking at the future in terms of Catholic relationships with the Jewish people. I want to start by emphasizing something quite uninstitutional, but absolutely central to the future of good relationships, and that is friendship. Without friendship between Catholics and Jews, there can be no future. There can be lots of institutional meetings, there can be lots of official events, but without learning trust and respect and genuinely being able to listen and engage with Jewish folk, Catholics are not going to get anywhere. And I'm not saying this in any sentimental way. It's true of certainly Pope John the 23rd with his many contacts with Jewish people, with Pope John Paul II and his very close friendships with Jewish people in Poland and his connection there with both Jews and anti-Semitic cultures within Catholicism. And it's true of Pope Francis with his very close friendships in Argentina with rabbis and the Jewish people. So I think basically wherever you are, whoever you are listening to this, that would be the one thing I could say. If you're a Catholic, the investment in the future is being serious about friendship. And from that, I think much will stem. Okay, I just want to make 3 points now about the future in terms of general issues, and then I want to look at 3 points in terms of doctrinal issues in the future. Ever since the Second Vatican Council, one question has remained, which is, what about Israel? It had been difficult for Catholics to acknowledge Israel because of various really problematic traditions within Catholicism. In Pius's comments with Theodore Herzl back in 1904, Pius was clear that he could not acknowledge the Jewish people because they had rejected Christ and therefore could not accept the desire of the Jewish people to resettle the land. And if they went there in a secular mode, equally he felt that would be more abominable. Okay. In 1993, a fundamental agreement was signed between the Holy See and Israel, whereby diplomatically there was a recognition of each other, and most importantly, from the Catholic viewpoint, legitimating the state of Israel in its official view on a social and political sphere. This did not exclude the recognition of Palestinians, because a fundamental agreement followed shortly afterwards with the PLO, and the recognition of a Palestinian state. Second point is that the Catholic Church went pretty well full throttle with the assistance of many, many Jews and friends to develop engagement with all forms of religious Judaism and non-religious Judaism. There was an official channel for the Vatican to carry out dialogue with different Jewish groups who came together in a coalition to form this partnership. And most interestingly, with John Paul II, a huge breakthrough in establishing official dialogue with the Israeli rabbinate. And since then, that group has met yearly to discuss things that are had in common. Now, obviously, all of these great steps, and they are important steps, have been hampered by particular issues where often, for example, where Pope Benedict, in conversation with Bishop Williamson, trying to get him back into the fold from a breakaway Catholic group, had not realized Williamson was a Holocaust denier. And many Jewish groups broke off conversations with the Catholic Church in disbelief that someone who was a Holocaust denier was being embraced, or at least trying to be embraced, back into the heart of the Catholic Church. There was a similar crisis when the canonization of Edith Stein, a Jewish woman who had become a Carmelite nun, was beatified and sainted. And again, these are the types of difficulties that inevitably arise and should be faced maturely, with each side both trying to understand the other's pain, but also respecting the doctrinal and religious integrity of the other. The third area, and it's equally unresolved in terms of the future, are many Jewish groups who are concerned that the Catholic Church is extremely defensive, connected with the charge of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewishness. My own view of this matter is twofold. On the one hand, it is absolutely vital to be truthful about our history as Catholics and to call out and see clearly where anti-Jewishness and anti-Semitism has existed. And there seems to me an enormous amount of evidence that it has in the culture, in particular practices of the church, and in the great theologians. Some of this was touched on in audio number 1. And one has to repent and ask for forgiveness, both from God and the Jewish people. Whether this actually cuts into the heart of acknowledging that the doctrinal authority of the magisterium is in question is another matter. For me, one has to look again at the historical record, but I believe that the doctrinal authority of the magisterium has never taught authoritatively anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic teachings. And that is vital in terms of retaining or making sense of the doctrine of the church. Okay, let me now turn to 3 doctrinal questions that stand in the future. And these are vital for really moving forward, and they're complicated. Fortunately, they all, or 2 of the 3, get highlighted in a document in 2015 from the Commission for Religious Relationship with the Jews from the Holy See. And in reflecting in 2015 on the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, they produced a document, pithy title, "The Gifts and the Calling of God Are Irrevocable, Romans 11:29, a reflection on theological questions pertaining to Catholic-Jewish relations on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of Nostra Aetate, number 4. Okay. Now, this document, I would strongly recommend that you have a look at it because it has a fantastic historical background of what happened since the council and a theological accounting for many of the implications. So for anyone interested in this issue, that is a must in reading. It contains 2 particular points I want to focus on, and it omits entirely a third that I also want to address. Now, the first point, and I think this is really important for the doctrinal core of Catholicism, because in the end, authentic Catholicism is generated through its doctrinal beliefs. We find in the Council the beginning of the teachings that the Jewish covenant is valid because God makes a promise and respects and keeps intact the gifts he has made to his people. That's stemming from Paul Romans. We find in this document the implication of that teaching slowly unfolding. Number 1, the acknowledgement that the Jewish religion is from God. It is not like other religions. Secondly, that it is an authentic covenant with the true and living God. And thirdly, this means that Catholics cannot but look carefully to discern God's ways amongst this people and in their practice of their religion. That's quite remarkable sea change from an attitude from the 1940s and 50s even. So Vatican II brings in this new sensibility. In paragraph 36 of the document, the teaching reaches, if you like, its high point. And I will read the quote directly because I think it's so momentous. At the same time, I recognize that Jewish people may not be terribly excited by it, but from a Catholic viewpoint, it's affirming profoundly religious Judaism. So the quote runs, that the Jews are participants in God's salvation is theologically unquestionable. But how that can be possible without confessing Christ explicitly is and remains an unfathomable divine mystery. End of quote. Note, it says that the participants in God's salvation, that the Jews are participants in God's salvation is theologically unquestionable. That is quite a remarkable shift in the tradition. From the council, we've moved to a new plateau which affirms that God's salvation is present here amongst the Jewish people. It doesn't go that direction without recognizing the difficulty for Catholics saying this. How that can be possible without confessing Christ explicitly is and remains a divine mystery. Okay, so that's one for kind of keeping Catholic theologians in employment for quite a few years. Although, interestingly, paragraph 17 of the same document suggests an answer, which is that there can be both explicit faith and implicit faith in Christ. And implicit faith in Christ traditionally was understood to be the possession of the righteous of Israel. Moses, all of the great teachers and patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish tradition who believed in God in their hearts and minds, implicit in that belief, because it was the true God, was an implicit faith in Christ. Now, whether that kind of theology is going to have to buttress this new teaching remains to be seen. But it is, if you like, carrying out a delicate balancing act of both affirming Judaism and, on the other hand, keeping the centrality of Christ in place. In the document, it rejects the so-called two-covenant view, that there are two ways to God, which are alternative ways. And in that sense, it brings out a drama that Catholic theology, I think, is still in the middle of, trying to make sense, but at the same time making sure one pole of that drama, i.e., the Jewish people are part of God's covenant, is not eradicated, as was the case historically. Second point, and it's connected, in paragraphs 40 to 43 in the 2015 document, it turns to the vexed question of mission to the Jews, or evangelization of the Jewish people. Now, right back from Vatican II days, when Rabbi Abraham Heschel famously said, when the leaked document came out of what would become Nostra Aetate, that he would rather return to Auschwitz than convert to Christianity. And what the rabbi meant, and we really need to take this seriously, if he was to convert, it would be a double victory for Hitler. The liquidation of the Jews, not only physically, but also spiritually. So becoming a Christian was to, if you like, renounce Jewish identity. At least if he was in Auschwitz, he would keep his Jewish identity and die with integrity. Now, this is so important. For Jews, the whole issue of Christian identity has meant an eradication of Jewish identity. And paragraph 40 recognizes this painful issue. It also recognizes that Judaism is not to be treated like other religions because it is already in engagement with the true and living God. It says in this section that there is no institutional mission to the Jews from the Catholic Church, both in practice and in principle. This is true in practice right now. Historically, it is not true in practice or in principle. So in some respects, that's a slight something that needs to be clarified more clearly. But if we take it as being a present tense statement, it's still slightly difficult to know what the meaning of institutional mission is because it hasn't been used in prior Catholic documents. But then the document makes clear that no Catholic can be a Catholic in conversation with anyone without, in some sense, witnessing to Christ. That element is impossible to exclude. So there's no intention to convert in terms of that is the cause of dialogue, but there is an openness that witnessing to Christ will happen inevitably as being part of a human being who is a Catholic. Now, the section ends on a very complex, ambivalent note, which I think has to be looked at in the future. And that is, it acknowledges that, and I'll read the quote from paragraph 43, it is and remains a qualitative definition of the Church of the New Covenant that it consists of Jews and Gentiles, even if the quantitative proportions of Jews and Gentile Christians may initially give a different impression. Now, what it's saying is that the early church was made up of Jews and Gentiles. That was a qualitative definition. And it implies the possibility that if it's a qualitative definition, then there must be a role for Jewish people within the church without losing their Jewishness. And of course, that is a double-edged sword, because I've noted Heschel was saying, conversion meant losing your Jewish identity. A Jew could say, so Catholics now have a new ploy, which is you can convert but keep your Jewish identity and be Catholic. But what about the fact that we don't want to convert? Okay. Second problem. The third and final one, which I want to address, is not mentioned in the document and in some respects is evaded, and this is the land promise. Now, what I'm going to say from this point on is my own opinion, but interestingly, Rabbi David Rosen raised this question at the official launch of the 2015 document, that the document had omitted any attention to what concerns Jews, possibly one of the most important questions, the status of the land. So my private view is that, one, I support what I call a Catholic minimalist Zionism, and that is to recognize that the gifts and promises that God makes to the Jewish people include the land. This is unquestionable in the traditions of what we call the Old Testament. And this means that the land has been given to the Jewish people so that they may witness to God's grace, mercy, and light to the nations. The land has been given not as some kind of privileged monarchy, but in fact as part of right worship. This promise indicates that God's love for his people endures. It does not indicate that Palestinians do not have a right to live on that land. And thirdly, while it may be a sign of the end times, which is what many Protestant Zionists believe, as a Catholic, I would say that Jesus warns us that only his Father knows this point in history. This does therefore not mean Catholics will support Israel as a state unconditionally, but will support the land and the people with a sense that this is part of God's plan. It cannot exclude the rights and the justice due to the Palestinians, but it is not just a political recognition. You can see from these three issues that what has characterized Catholic Jewish relationships, controversy, difficulties, and bewildering questions will remain. But the future will be held more by friendship and, I hope, trust, so that we can face these questions, working together for a safe and better world, and one in which God is honored, recognized, and pointed to by both of our communities' actions. Thank you for listening. This is the end of Lecture 3.
This is Faydra Shapiro recording session 3 of Pathfinder course, Catholic Jewish Relations, and this is the segment Into the Future. When we think about kind of into the future of Catholic Jewish relations, the first place we need to begin is with a recognition that Nostra Aetate isn't the end of the story. I mean, notwithstanding our shared discomfort with the word revolution that came up in our conversation from session 2, I'll also note that revolutions don't occur suddenly in a single event or on one day. What is really revolutionary, we might say, about Nostra Aetate is what it inspired and what has followed in the now almost 60 years since. And the fruits of Nostra Aetate have been quite rich indeed. Now, in the second session, in the conversation that Gavin DaCosta and I had together, I recalled my disappointment many years ago on my first reading of the document, kind of like, "What? That's it? What's the big deal?" But if you'll excuse the comparison, over the years, I've come to read Nostra Aetate like, kind of like the written law, a written law that requires exposition through an oral law. And much like the oral law in Judaism, interpretations tend to be far longer than the original text, addressing questions like, what does it mean? How do we live with it? What about this or that particular issue? The real impact of Nostra Aetate can be seen in the documentary, if not avalanche, then at least significant flow of official Catholic documents in its wake that strive to work out the implications of this teaching. And of course, we can't ignore the wrestling that Nostra Aetate and its fruit has prompted from Jews as we try to navigate this changing relationship from our side. But it's not just a matter of theologians and thinkers doing that intellectual work. It's also institutional. Nostra Aetate inspired many highly regarded centers of Catholic Jewish studies at educational institutions across North America, including, St. Joseph's, CTU, St. Leo's, Sacred Heart, Providence College, Fordham, Holy Cross, and more. In fact, the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome has a center for Judaic studies named after Cardinal Bea, who was so instrumental in making Nostra Aetate a reality. Again, it's not just intellectual, it's also exegetical, where in the wake of Nostra Aetate, where the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament is no longer to be read as a relationship between inferior and superior. And we're reading the New Testament in the context of the Hebrew Bible, in the context of ancient Israel, is actually encouraged. We see the fruit of Nostra Aetate in thinking about Christology for Christians, and understanding that any thinking about the historical Jesus must be connected to his Jewish context. We see it in church thinking about ecclesiology, that properly understanding the church must include thinking about Judaism, and that the relationship between the church and Judaism, as we've said, is unique and unlike the relationship between the church and any other faith. So Nostra Aetate, as Gavin said, kind of clears the blockage so that something positive and vital can flow. And indeed, it does and continues to do so. So that revolution is unfolding right in front of us. Now, onto some specific matters, and fair warning, I'm not really going to engage a theological conversation about Catholic doctrine, no matter how much that, I might enjoy that, but more to give a sense of how Jews hear, understand, and respond to the future of Catholic-Jewish relations. And I think even more immediately, Jews really don't understand or care very much about Catholic doctrine and theology. And I think we need to remember that this is one of the great asymmetries in Catholic-Jewish relations. I mean, Catholics are trying to work out matters of doctrine and theology, but, Jews really couldn't care less. Jews are lying awake worrying, both historically and today, about how to keep the Jewish people alive, both qualitatively and quantitatively. So Catholics tend to talk about covenants, election, salvation, eschatology. But Jews tend to want to talk about very practical matters, about anti-Semitism and about Israel. So specifically, I'm going to follow Gavin's lead here and consider the issues of anti-Semitism, Israel, and conversion. Now, when it comes to anti-Semitism, I think it's really important for Catholics to understand that any documentary statement is really insufficient for Jews. I mean, documents are quite interesting, but Jews live with results and not with doctrines and documents. Now, of course, there are very specific issues on this front that Jews seek attention to, particularly when it comes to the church record and the Shoah. So the whole question of Pius XII is of great interest to Jews who are involved in Jewish-Christian relations. And when it comes to the level of statements, the last few popes have spoken out very clearly and strongly against anti-Semitism. So I think we can be very hopeful there. But the real question is, for Jews, how can the church, and by this I mean specifically parishes, lay Catholics, if I can say the non-institutional church, how can Catholics in a concrete way realize the promises of Nostra Aetate and actively combat anti-Semitism? I think it's essential to remember two things. First is that I ask this question against the background of an absolutely shocking resurgence of anti-Semitism in our day. I mean, the Shoah and our expectation of never again is still ringing in our ears. And today, Jews are once again feeling particularly vulnerable and at risk. When it doesn't feel safe to be identifiably Jewish in parts of Europe and America, we want to know where our allies are. And second, I want to remind listeners that for Catholics, rooting out and condemning anti-Semitism is not just because, mean people suck, or because we appreciate values of pluralism and tolerance. But if, and this is again one of the implications of Nostra Aetate that we've mentioned, if there is something Jewish at the heart of the church, then combating anti-Semitism ought to be properly understood as a Christian duty, a fight really also for the soul of the church and for the people of Jesus and his family. Now, the issue of Israel. And I realize that for Catholics, this is fundamentally a theological issue. But for Jews, it overwhelmingly is not so. I mean, certainly there are theological arguments to be made. But overwhelmingly, Israel is an existential survival issue for Jews. And it's immensely challenging for us to understand why that element isn't really so obvious for the church. And we would think that it's really not that complicated, that if Catholics value a world with Jews in it, then Israel is essential for that Jewish future, both in terms of physical safety and cultural and religious flourishing. And let me also say that I don't think that this support for Jews living in safety and security in our ancestral homeland need in any way imply that Palestinians should not equally have rights and expectations to live in safety and security. Finally, the thorny question of conversion. Now, I think I raised this issue in session 2, and I imagine it will come out again some more in our conversation together. But we have to remember the massive distinction between conversion by choice and conversion by force. Now, of course, we can also get into the question of if a Jew today can actually make a truly free choice to convert to Christianity. But that takes us philosophically far afield. And I want to say that I absolutely believe that this kind of free choice can be made. And I also believe that a Jew who either chooses Catholicism or who is raised as a Catholic should maintain a Jewish identity. Although what that could and should look like is its own very good question. But, and here's my point, we need to differentiate fundamentally between conversion by choice and conversion through power first. Now, Jews, I think, need to understand that a Catholic hope for the entry of the Jewish people into the church is completely reasonable for Catholics. But I wish that Catholics could understand that for Jews, this hope reads like denigration and a disrespect for Judaism. It doesn't make sense to us. And let's face it, it's also a rather thorny theological question for the church as well. How to, at the same time, honor and value Judaism, while at the same time, kind of assert its insufficiency. And it is a very real problem, very kind of down-to-earth problem in terms of Jewish-Christian relations, when the ideal Jew, so to speak, is a baptized Jew. Because for Jews, a baptized Jew is precisely the opposite. So while Jews should understand this Catholic hope, Catholics need to understand the corollary Jewish fear. And it's here where we're reminded that Judaism and Catholicism have much in common, but are fundamentally different faith systems with different histories and different beliefs and different hopes. So I would like to conclude really with the matter that Gavin began with, and that is friendship. I mean, it's friendship, in my experience, that makes the difference. It's through friendship that we can have these challenging conversations in a fruitful rather than a hostile kind of way. It's through friendship that we can take the time to listen to one another in a deep kind of way and hopefully even accompany each other in our respective quests for holiness. It is through friendship that we can cherish what we share and at the same time respect our significant differences.
Hello, I'm Gavin DeCosta, and it's a great pleasure to be talking with Faydra Shapiro on this first audio. So, Faydra, I just want to start by saying it was important for me to hear your howevers and to remind me that the kind of my doctrinal attempt to focus on what's important may be like slightly irrelevant in the face of a constant culture in Christianity where Jews have been battered and killed and given a kind of civic, social, political treatment that calls for nothing but just stopping in my tracks. And hearing the almost the kind of witness of history. So I do want to say that, however, I heard it and it's painful to hear, and I'm grateful you raised it. And there's a bit of me that also uh, makes me realize, as a Catholic, I'm not sure about this, that there may be an element of asymmetry about the importance of doctrine. Okay, so my view is that over generations, not immediately, but over generations, what the doctrine is filters down through the liturgy, through art, through culture, through sermons, so that eventually it does make shifts and transformations. So perhaps my focus on doctrine is the attempt to say, look, long term, this is the way that the Catholic culture can change. I don't know whether you, in any sense, were wanting to say, no, it's irrelevant, but uh, that's my focus on that doctrine.
No, I mean, this absolutely makes sense to me. And I don't mean to downplay in any way the importance of doctrine for the church. But, as you say, I think that Catholics think like Catholics and Jews think like Jews. And so we need to be mindful of what Jews bring into this relationship, right? Like Jews don't really get the importance of doctrine. There are very few doctrines in Judaism, and most Jews ignore them anyhow. So, you know, practice, correct practice, is what makes a Jew orthodox, not belief or adherence to doctrine. And so, this might be one of those fundamental asymmetries, as you say, between Catholics and Jews that makes it difficult for us to hear each other clearly. I mean, it's not just about historical experience, is it? It's also about our way of thinking and about our way of seeing the world. So I certainly agree with your point, and I think that changing doctrine is absolutely essential. Um, but it is insufficient. It's insufficient. But as you say, if you look at it over generations, over time, and if there is a proper mechanism for it filtering through, filtering down into the pews through catechesis and liturgical reforms and homilies, if there's some sort of, I don't know, institutional support for making that doctrine actually reach people, then over time, I think that you're quite right that the role, changing doctrine will ultimately change action, but that's not an immediate kind of thing.
If I could just give a very ad hoc example, which I think struck me. I teach at the Angelicum Pontifical University in Rome, and most of my students are seminarians, priests, religious, people who are involved in Catholic education and culture. And what they are concerned about in the course is understanding Catholic doctrine. And when we come to this issue of Vatican II, which we cover in the second audio, sometimes there's a real surprise, even shock. But what is so important for me is that these students are really, really committed to trying to be serious about what the church is teaching and to transmit it in their life and their practice. So there's a sense in which dealing with, if you like, the teaching and preaching classes of Catholic culture, I'm kind of particularly focused there. But I agree with you totally. And this is certainly true in the United States, for example, where there's a particular commission on the Bishops' Committee that sift through Catholic textbooks that are being used in schools. And it was shocking to discover that, you know, 30 years after Vatican II, the same tropes of anti Jewish sentiment were still in those textbooks. So kids are going to be picking that up. And, you know, it's not just at church, but schools. It's not just at schools, but at home. So I'm kind of aware that this is a very multi pronged educational, cultural shift. But perhaps the biggest shift is in the heart. That at the end of the day, the deep anti Jewish and anti Semitic instincts of Western culture are going to be there for a long, long time. And maybe it's an even more important thing that Catholics are in the forefront in calling that out and saying how unacceptable it is. And of course, we do come to difficult situations where I find Jewish colleagues saying, oh, if you're anti Semitic, you should be involved with this particular organization or behind that particular cause. And then we have a kind of issue of, you know, kind of complex prudential judgment.
Right. No, I absolutely agree that it needs to be multi-pronged for sure, and that it can't become politicized. Um, yeah, I mean, in some ways, we can think about, I think, anti-Semitism and the church as sort of like an autoimmune disease where it's come to attack. I mean, if we understand that there is something Jewish at the heart of the church, then uh, you know, in some way, in a very self-defeating kind of way, the church is, I don't know, at war with itself. And so recognizing that in order to build a healthy church into the future, combating anti-Semitism is an essential piece of that. And that's not a political program. That's, I don't know, it's something deeply spiritual.
I'm wondering whether we could turn to the source of spirituality in the Catholic Church in terms of the New Testament. Now, in your comments, you touched on this issue, which rightly you said is a pretty large, big, thorny, and difficult question. And for me, one of the issues here, and it would be good to hear your thoughts on it, the New Testament at one level is a kind of testimony of a rivalry between an intra-Jewish conversation. One group, followers of Jesus, say, hey, he's the Messiah. And another group are saying, maybe not. How come the Romans are still here? How come we're being oppressed? How come this guy has the characteristics that don't fit, etc., etc.? So fundamentally, there is a document which is an intra-Jewish squabble in the hands now of Gentiles, who are the primary readers. And I think that's a great difficulty at one level for Catholicism, because there's this constant kind of having to step back and say, hey, this isn't diatribe against Jews per se. This is actually an conversation within a family that we're listening to, but we didn't belong to that family as Gentiles. I don't know what you think about that difficulty that I'm ascribing.
No, I think you're really right. I mean, when it comes to the sort of Gentile church listening in on an internal Jewish conversation, I think that it is kind of, the an amnesia, not to keep using medical terms, but a certain loss of memory on the part of the Gentile church about the Jewishness of the context and the Jewishness of the debate that helps to make it sound like it's a you know Christians against Jews, which is completely anachronistic kind of reading. But at the same time, when you speak about what the New Testament is, um, how it is received, how it is read, how it's understood, how it's acted upon is also part of what it is. I mean, of course, the whole complex philosophical question of where does meaning actually reside? And I think that we have to remember that it doesn't live just in the text and the or in the author's intention, but there is that dynamic relationship between the reader and the text. So I think that we can't really talk about whether the New Testament is, I'll say, anti-Semitic. I use that word, with great caution, but we can't talk about whether the New Testament is anti-Jewish or not without a sense of how it has been read and interpreted and acted upon throughout history.
Uh, I, I, I'm torn by the point you're making, Phaedra. I agree entirely. The history of the Christian Church is the history of the readings of our sacred text. And those readings have constantly, through their being read in by a Gentile audience, have been turning the New Testament anti-Semitic. But it's important for me as a Catholic to argue the case, and I hope this isn't a defensive argument, that if the text itself is in some sense genuinely and intrinsically corrupted or problematic, then the question of calling it revelation has to be faced up to. Now, this is not to say that there isn't a recognition that the text is written in a historical context. It contains all sorts of elements which may be time bound, etc. But in a way, what's at stake here is the question of revelation. So I want to kind of push this and say the recovery that's going on in the Catholic Church, which we'll talk about in number 2 and 3, the recovery of trying to read those texts as they were intended and as they communicate the truth of God's communication, has to have a confidence that the text is not just how the community read it, not that that's what you're saying, but that actually in the text there is a good news. Now, I think one of the points that you made so powerfully is that text has not been good news for Jews. It has spelt their destruction and oppression and uh, constant harassment. And I'm wanting to say, if the text is from God, and I'm not saying the text is from God, but the word of God comes through the text, then there has to be a kind of different picture from what we've been seeing. So I'm kind of still wanting to say, at the end of the day, I want to argue that the New Testament is not intrinsically anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. I don't know whether that is a kind of argument that cuts ice or even interests you.
It absolutely interests me. I mean, even if we step away from the question of historical experience, and I am by no means a New Testament scholar, uh, but just on like a purely theological level, um, for me, and I think it's in Hebrews 8, maybe verse 13, maybe. Um, but you know, once there is a newer and better covenant, and the old one is obsolete, even if we didn't say the old one is obsolete, or even if we said there is now a newer and better covenant, it seems to me that there's a real challenge there. How do you work out newer and better without falling into anti Judaism? How do you hold two essential beliefs together at the same time? How do you say that the first covenant made with the people of Israel is good, and at the same time that the second covenant enacted through Christ is better? And how does that, is there a way to believe in a new and better covenant without at some level rejecting Judaism? And I think that, you know, uh, I think, and maybe this is in contrast to you, I think that at some level there has to be a rejection of Judaism in the church. I mean, otherwise we're down a path of dual covenant. We can expect Catholics to be converting in droves to Judaism, and I am not sure that we need to be afraid of this kind of anti-Judaism. I mean, it seems to me that it is the basic prerogative of a tradition to believe that it holds the truth, and that other religions do not hold the same fullness of truth. And maybe here we're getting into that question of, what is anti-Judaism and what is its relationship to anti-Semitism? I'd be interested to hear what you have to say about this, Gavin.
I'm not really sure, is what is what I wanted to say. I think you're kind of going to the nub of the matter, which we'll pick up in audio 3 in terms of the future relationships. But it seems to me that you're raising a question which is very profoundly difficult for Catholics. In some sense, has an equivalent type of question in the Jewish tradition, which we could go into or not, which is that if you believe that there has been a true communication of God, which brings a people into a living relationship, there are going to be, by virtue of that, contrary communications in the world and in culture that you're going to have to say, not sure that seems to be from God. Okay, so the traditions we both share against idolatry are very powerful, that there cannot be a worship of anything but God. Now, the relationship then between the Jewish followers of Jesus in the New Testament and those Jews who were not following Jesus is certainly a very, very mixed one. There's a critique going on. There's a complaint going on saying, hey, you guys are not being faithful to the covenant you've been given. Now, the issue then hinges right now on whether this meant that that covenant made by God to his people is dead and deadening, which is the kind of way in which Christians developed the tradition in patristic and medieval period, or whether, in fact, Paul and strong elements of the New Testament were not saying it is dead and deadening, but there is still some, if you like, response that could be made to this figure who is the Messiah. Now, when we come to that platform number one, which says this religion is not irrelevant or erased, that the covenant always exists, which is what Paul is saying, we come to the new level of the difficulty, which I think you're rightly focusing on, and I'm going to be really crude. It's like saying Christianity is the equivalent of the iPhone 13 and Judaism is the iPhone 8. It does the job. You can communicate with God, but it doesn't have such a fabulous camera. I shouldn't be advertising for Apple here, but there's a sort of like really super model which contains and continues with that past, but upgrades it. And I think then the question becomes, is that, from Christianity's viewpoint, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic? Now, it's a thin line, and I'm going to just say this, and then you can come back. In Dignitatis Humanae, another document on the Second Vatican Council, and we'll be speaking about the Council in the next session, it makes it totally clear that while one may disagree with others or even see that they are in error, and that's not in relationship to Judaism, it's just, in general, nothing can mean that the dignity of the human person can be called into question. So I'm saying there's a kind of basic tension. Intrinsically, both of our religious traditions see idolatry and criticize and condemn it. And then the question is, when you see idolatry, not that I'm saying Jews are idolatrous at all, on the contrary, but I'm just giving this example. But when you see idolatry, does it then lead to the necessary persecution and suppression of it in a way that involves violence? If the answer to that is yes, then Christianity is going to always remain anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. You're right.
And I think that distinction that you raise is really important between, texts and doctrine are one thing, but texts and doctrine and power and misuse of power is, I think, where things really go off the rails. I think that an anti-Jewish text doesn't harm people, but it's that combination with power, misused power, that does. But I myself would tend to go, with that, maybe in a different direction, to say that the essential question is not, then, is the New Testament, anti-Jewish, but rather, how can Catholics learn to read the New Testament in ways that are not anti-Jewish? And maybe that's the sort of move into the future with the question of Scripture.
For sure. And I think in terms of the third audio, we need to talk about that. But there are ways, and this is really important. This Sunday that's just gone, as a Catholic, I go to Mass on Sundays and sometimes more than on Sundays. But A friend of mine called Faydra, Shapiro, was actually speaking about the gospel that was part of the Sunday liturgy. And this is the Polish University Heschel Center have got this great project. And what was such an amazing thing was to listen to a Jewish voice reflecting on the New Testament. And, I'm not just saying this because Phaedra happens to be here, but it did make me realize the Jewish context shifted so much in how to receive it. And after listening to Phaedra, I listened to Bishop Robert Barron, who's one of my favorite Sunday preachers. I should say, if my priest at the local church listens, I listen to him as well. But I like just getting a few inputs on Sunday. Um, and it made me realize, and Bishop Robert Barron is great, but we really lack if we're not listening to Jewish voices saying this story about Jesus being the fisher of men and the disciples being fishers of men is a really weird image. We've got to recognize that it doesn't necessarily echo quite comfortably in terms of what we call the Old Testament. So I think what you're saying is spot on. There's a massive process of education. And what I found, this is true of listening to Phaedra, it's true of listening to Amy Jill Levine, other Jewish people who are engaging with the New Testament, is that the message is not like, how come you guys believe all this nonsense? But in the Jewish context, there are a lot of other echoes going on that you're missing. So that will come in session 3, but I'm in agreement that learning to read our scripture is just a new part of a kind of process that's beginning for Catholics. Maybe we should finish, though, Phaedra, addressing your question as well. Is there a difference between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism? So, quite interestingly, some Jews are criticized as self-hating. They're Jewish, but they have certain views that are then seen as anti-Semitic. Gentiles can be criticized for being both. I think in terms of the Catholic Church, we have this really big question. The sense of the criticism of any religion or culture or person that does not yet speak and confess Christ, is that an anti? And I think I'm trying to say, no, it's not, because it's not a kind of condemnation. In fact, one of the most important insights of the Council and the modern period is that often people make decisions in profound good faith. They're not willful. Is there a sense that Phaedra, who I'm talking to, has rejected the truth? And I think I'll let you answer that in a moment. But my sense is that I've never met a Jew who ever says, yeah, I see that Jesus is the Messiah, but I just don't want to follow Jesus. I've just never met that. So it's about taking the good faith seriously of a person's path and learning from that how to respect and hear how God is moving that person. But I'll let Phaedra have the last word for this.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Gavin. That's quite a dense topic, and I'm sure that it's one that we will be getting to address in our third session into the future. For now, this is Phaedra Shapiro and Gavin DaCosta. Thank you very much for listening.